For the last 6 years, I've been researching occupations and really looking at issues such as where occupational culture is a very important thing for me in terms of understanding how people in various roles experience their work and actually how their work starts to perhaps explain away their understanding of the social world around them. And I've done that in various occupations in mental health nursing and also more recently in the police. And one thing that comes through in those kinds of occupations is that they're often regarded as an occupation where extremes exist. And what I mean by that is that there are occupations where there is often the potential or the actuality of risk and danger to an individual. And 4 years ago, I was fortunate enough to work with a couple of colleagues from the University of Chester on a project which really from the outset aimed to think about the importance of occupational culture. And that was a piece of research that we've completed in the area of looking at veterans who have experienced domestic violence, both whilst they were active in service, but also once in civilian life. So their experiences across those two different contexts. And really, for me and for the others involved in that project, occupational culture of the military is a fundamental aspect of understanding the way in which domestic violence manifested itself, the way in which it was managed, and certainly what we've aimed to do in this study is try and seek out what kind of help seeking veterans might well have taken, or actually what prohibited them. So the research itself, it was a qualitative piece of research. We undertook research interviews with 6 participants, quite a small sample, but hugely challenging in terms of recruiting to this piece of research. And what we did was we undertook interviews, and for us the idea of a biographical kind of testimony of these veterans, there was a huge richness associated with the stories that they had to tell. So whilst it was small in terms of sample size, this research has a range of rich kind of assessments of the issue. So a key aim of the research was really to unveil the interconnectedness of military culture and experiences of domestic violence, and how those two things might in some way be related, and what some of the key aspects of those might be. And in doing so, because culture really is a way, or military culture within the organisation affects people's outlook on their social role, on their occupational role, and also on maybe their familial role as well. And so we move forward in determining the importance of culture, but in the words and in the language of the participants themselves. So the key findings from the research really in terms of broad themes were twofold. Firstly, that it was the culture and occupational culture within the military was important as a mechanism of support, that there were opportunities, and a number of participants talked of the help seeking which they gained through negotiated kind of networks with their colleagues. In terms of help seeking from kind of the institution itself, whether that be counselling or welfare support, not so much amongst the people that we spoke to. But one thing that came through very, very strongly was this issue about how culture and some of the kind of the motifs, the rituals, the rites of military culture actually went some way to stopping or prohibiting a realisation of the situation that these men found themselves in the domestic setting. So we looked and we delved deeper into actually what military culture came to represent, and there's been much research and debate on this already, and so there's very much a rich vein of understanding on what military culture can be seen to be. Often its culture, and a lot of my work previously been heavily informed by the work of people like Harrison Trice, who discuss what culture within an organisation or an occupation might be. That's along the lines of various rites, rituals, rites of passage, stories, and how all these things are hugely important. And it's often culture within organisations is an understanding of how informal norms actually operate alongside formal rules. So formal expectations that might be placed on members of the organisation, but also how there needs to be cooperation amongst peers. So military culture specialists have gone a long way to discuss the processes and the kind of some of the extreme aspects of military culture that exist. A lot of it is assumed to be purposeful for the role of, say, infantry, or for the military more widely, as being authoritative, as being able to rely on one another. The creation, which some authors have termed as a warrior ethos. Others have talked about how and in what ways individuals' identities are stripped down as a process through training, as a process of socialisation in the kind of the military bubble, in the military in rank and file. And so that was important. This kind of stripping down and building up into an approved identity, and that improved identity having certain value sets, certain beliefs, and a certain outlook on their role. And importantly, some authors, Hockey in particular, have talked about how individuals in roles in the military come to reconcile the risks in which they're confronted with, generally, in the role. In being able to deal with risk, imminent danger, also being able to kind of deal with the kind of some of the mundanity, the continuum of kind of moments of sheer terror and long periods of boredom. And that was important because that has a particular way of shaping identity too. So in terms of findings, well, what did we find when we started to research? Well, firstly, in looking at the intersections of domestic violence experience and military culture, we worked towards understanding the experiences themselves. So a lot of the research drew enormous detail of some of the harrowing episodes of violence over often a long and sustained period of time. All of the participants in the study were no longer in the military, and they were no longer in that intimate relationship where they'd experienced violence, and indeed they were seeking support at the time in which they were interviewed. So some of those experiences themselves were interesting in terms of how the veterans discussed them, the language that they used, the type of vocabulary. In particular, when there was a discussion over non-physical violence and abuse that they'd experienced in the domestic setting, they talked about how there was a hierarchy in the household, and that they were subordinated to by their partner. They talked about an abeyance that they must maintain in home life, and that was no different than actually what they were experiencing in their service life, and that there was a continuation across these borders between work and home. In terms of physical violence, some of the acts of violence were awful. They were harrowing to listen to, and in terms of what some of these veterans experienced, it was hugely moving to listen to them speak of them. But there were examples whereby there were serious assaults, there was attacks with weapons, and so on. But in terms, like I say, in terms of the dialogue that was used to to kind of discuss these, it was the amount of detail that was provided of these acts of violence was quite interesting in how it was articulated. Often there would be language and phrasing like it was like hand-to-hand combat. She attacked me with a closed fist, which were hugely telling of kind of an understanding of what violence was from a kind of a work setting and into a domestic setting. But at the same time, it was interesting to know that these instances were simply dealt with. They were put to one side. There was no help-seeking behaviour at that time. I think for me, I feel increasingly uneasy with the sentiments of and the kind of the propagation of dialogue which talks of deviant veterans or deviant servicemen or women. The idea that people are returning maybe from conflict or are leaving the services as problematic or as a risky population to others, I think is hugely corrosive, and I think it's a toxic narrative. I think what in determining and being able to unveil and being able to kind of illuminate on some of the individual plights that veterans experience, we start to develop a body of awareness and a body of literature which can counter some of these normative tropes, these kind of bogus, easy, cheap shots which might appear in the media, which might appear actually in policy or official dialogue. And so I think what we have a responsibility to do is to analyse this data with care. I think it's often an unfortunate and difficult situation that we find ourselves in, having to almost justify even further or think of innovative ways in which we can represent these views, opinions and experiences, because we're all aware that we're having to kind of challenge a normative view on the veteran. I think that's an exciting thing to do, and I think we definitely, for want of a better phrasing, have our work cut out. But I think it's something which we can encourage in our pedagogy. It's something which we can encourage in terms of the way in which we write, the way in which we start to represent these issues and how we can cut across boundaries so we can speak to a number of audiences in being able to present these experiences.